Welcome back, Anth 220. This is week number 3. We're going to be doing 2 lectures this week, and the first one is going to be the second part of our macronutrient lecture. We started that last week with carbohydrates, and this week we're going to continue with lipids and protein. When you think of lipids, you probably tend to think of fat, and that's accurate. But, like with carbohydrates, fat tends to get a bad rap in our society. Now, yes, lipids can contribute to the development of a number of chronic diseases, but some lipids or some fats are essential to a healthy body and a healthy diet. You can find lipids in most foods. Now, because of that, many people, especially in our society, tend to consume too much in terms of lipids, or at least too much of a certain type of lipid. And that can have health problems. When you hear the term fat, and in light of nutritional anthropology, think lipids. Fat and lipid refers to the same thing. However, fat tends to be an unflattering term, which refers to what is actually a fairly diverse nutrient family. And we'll look at that: the triglycerides, the phospholipids, and the sterols. So the 3 groupings of lipids that we'll talk about briefly: triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Triglycerides includes fatty acids, which I'm sure is a term that you have heard of before. But what is a fatty acid? Or more accurately, what are triglycerides? And here I've got a few images up on the screen showing you a basic triglyceride. We're just going to focus on some of the basics, so we won't get into a lot of the details, which some of you know, and for some of you it would be a bit overwhelming, but we just don't have time. So for the triglycerides, you know what that is, even if you've never even heard of the term. Triglycerides, you can break that down. Tri, as in 3, and in this case you get 3 fatty acid chains, or chains of carbon, and then glycerides, which is the backbone. It's glycerol, right? So for every triglyceride, you have 1 glycerol molecule in which 3 fatty acids are attached, which are chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms. Fatty acids differ from each other based on the number of atoms in the chain and the place where double bonds form between carbon atoms, if they form at all, which is part of the chemical structure. Now, it's not too important, but it is that structure that gives us saturated or unsaturated fatty acids. So let's take a brief look at that. Saturated fatty acids refers to the amount of hydrogen in a carbon chain. Here I've got on the screen a few images of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. And you're looking at that chain of carbon with all of these single bonds between adjacent carbon atoms and single bonds, of course, with the hydrogen on both sides of the carbon. So, saturated fatty acids, you have all of this hydrogen forming single bonds and single bonds between all of the carbon atoms. In fact, you got as much hydrogen in that chain as possible, right? So you're looking at single bonds. Once you remove one of the hydrogens, you're going to need a double bond that forms somewhere in that chain to compensate for the lack of a bond, right? So you're going to force a double bond between adjacent carbons. A saturated fatty acid is a saturated chain of carbon, a carbon chain that is full of hydrogen, as much hydrogen as possible. And an unsaturated fatty acid is exactly what it sounds like. It is missing a hydrogen, or maybe several hydrogens. So you form a double bond in one or several places to account for that. You have a point or multiple points of unsaturation. So therefore, it is an unsaturated fatty acid. Now, that can be one point, a monounsaturated fatty acid, or it could be multiple points, polyunsaturated fatty acids. In addition to that, you've probably heard of the omegas. Did you ever wonder what those are if you didn't know already? Something like the omega-3 fatty acid or the omega-6 fatty acid. What does that mean? All polyunsaturated fats are given an omega number. And what the omega number means is the location of the first unsaturated carbon on the chain. So omega-3 fatty acids has its first unsaturated carbon 3 places away from the methyl end, which is the carbon with the 3 hydrogens, right? Or omega-6 has its first unsaturated carbon 6 places away. And it's all of this chemistry involved, the length of the chain, the degree of saturation or unsaturation, the position of the omega. All of this gives food a certain characteristic. Now think about this. You have multiple different kinds of fats, right? Some are more stable, some are less stable. More saturated fats tend to be stable. They are more solid at room temperature, for example, animal fat. But unsaturated fats tend to be more liquid at room temperature, something like vegetable oil. And when I say a stable fat, I mean they are more resistant to oxidation. Fat begins to spoil once you expose it to oxygen. It begins to smell funny, it begins to taste funny, it becomes rancid. Why does it become rancid? Because those double bonds are not as stable. They begin to break and form new bonds with oxygen. And by doing so, the chain begins to fall apart. Now, we can try to stop that by sealing our food in airtight containers with little light and in a cool atmosphere. We might call that a refrigerator, right? But we can also add antioxidants, which we will touch on a little bit later. And that will compete with oxygen, and it can help protect the food from becoming rancid too quickly. Our bodies need fatty acids, and as it turns out, our bodies can make fatty acids. All of them, and there are several hundreds of different types, all of them except for 2, which are called the essential fatty acids, because we have to get those in our diet. Our bodies cannot construct those. These are the linoleic acid, called omega-6, and the linolenic acid, called the omega-3. The linoleic omega-6 fatty acid forms part of our cell membranes. It promotes blood clotting. It regulates blood pressure by helping to constrict the arteries. And linolenic omega-3 is involved in a variety of cellular functions. It's used for growth, for visual acuity, cognitive development, and it's also involved in regulating blood pressure, but not by constricting, by dilating the arteries. It helps to prevent blood clotting and regulate the heartbeat. Now, where do we get these 2 essential fatty acids? Well, in a variety of different foods. For example, vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, seafood, especially fish. One more component about triglycerides that you certainly have heard of is cis and trans fats. You might not know what these are, so I'll briefly explain these. The cis and trans fatty acids refer to different types of bonds. So you can have a cis bond and a trans bond. And both of these are in unsaturated fat. So we're only talking about unsaturated fats. For most unsaturated fats that you would find naturally in nature, this is going to be the cis bond or a cis fatty acid. Okay, if you're looking at a fatty acid, you have that chain of carbon, you have the hydrogen bonds there, and you have a point of unsaturation for an unsaturated fatty acid. That means you have a double bond, right, between two carbons. But on which side of the carbon atom are you going to find the bound hydrogen? So if we're looking at the two carbons that have the double bond, right, this unsaturated point, in a cis bond, you find that the hydrogen is on the same side of the carbon, right? So it's a cis fatty acid. But if you find the hydrogen on opposite sides, right, of the two carbon atoms that have a double bond, well, that's a fairly odd combination. And although it does occasionally happen in nature, and quite frequently in manufactured foods, it's not a frequent bond. So this would be the trans fatty acid bond. They behave more like a saturated fat, the trans fatty acid, and this can lead to an increase in some negative health consequences, such as blood cholesterol and an increase in heart disease. This slide is just to help you keep all of these differences straight. So we talked about saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids, and what that looks like, or what we're actually referring to on the chemical atomical scale. And then we broke apart unsaturated fatty acids into cis and trans fatty acids. How about phospholipids? We'll talk briefly about phospholipids and sterols and then get into some of the other aspects of lipids. So all of those triglycerides that we talked about, those make up about 95% of all the lipids that we tend to get in our diet. The other mere 5% comes from phospholipids and sterols. The phospholipids are almost exactly like the triglycerides. They have the glycerol backbone, and they have fatty acids attached, but not 3 fatty acids, only 2. And that third attachment site is actually a phosphate rather than another fatty acid. It's because of that phosphate, and you can see that on this image here, that you get fats that can emulsify with water and with fat. And what that means is you get fat that can mix with fat, or you can mix with water. So salad dressing, for example, mayonnaise, candy bars, right? We use phospholipids in the food industry because they can mix with water, even though they are fat. They act, or they can act, as emulsifiers because they allow fat to be water soluble and fat soluble. So you can mix fats with water. They help other fat soluble substances in the body, like vitamins and hormones, to easily pass into and out of cells. And it's because of that same property that you don't get fat that sticks to the lining of your arteries and veins, right? It keeps all that fat suspended in your body, in your blood, and other fluids, so long as your diet is healthy, right? And they also are major components of cell membranes, which makes sense because they're acting as emulsifiers, and they're able to suspend fat in your blood. Now, you hear about all this stuff in biology or physiology or maybe other classes, cells and organelles and cellular membranes and all this other stuff. But what is all of that actually made of? Well, it's made of nutrients, and we're looking at the interplay between nutrition and chemistry. And last are the sterols. These lipids have a different structure. It's a 4-ring structure, not the chains that we find with the previous 2 forms of lipids. And you already know about sterols. Chances are you have even said the name sometime in the last, 24, 48 hours. One of the most common known sterols is cholesterol, right? Cholesterol. We find sterols in plants, animals, but only the animal foods contain significant amounts of cholesterol. The sterols in plants actually help our bodies reduce blood cholesterol levels because they compete with cholesterol for absorption. And of course, cholesterol is by far not the only sterol. We also have hormones. All of your hormones, your sex hormones, are lipids: testosterone, estrogen, androgen. All of your adrenal hormones are lipids. And guess what? Even a vitamin D, which we classify as a vitamin based on its activity in your body, but it is actually a lipid. And more specifically, it is a sterol. When we think of cholesterol, we also tend to think of bad foods. Well, that's not accurate. First, cholesterol is a component of our bodies. It's a component of cell membranes. It's a sterol that our bodies use. Second, and maybe even more important, cholesterol doesn't come only from food. In fact, most of the cholesterol in our bodies comes from within, from our own bodies. Your body makes cholesterol. It is making cholesterol right now in your liver. And it's not just making a little bit of it. It's making around 1,500 milligrams per day. The daily value for intake is only 300 milligrams. Your body is making many times that per day. And of course, cholesterol can have, or sterols in general, can have negative effects, but only once it begins to accumulate in your artery walls, right? And then it can lead to something like heart attacks or strokes, which is part of the importance of a balanced diet and exercise. We've already touched on what lipids actually do in our body. Last week, hopefully you remember, we talked about glucose and how about half of your body's energy comes from glucose. The other half, and it's actually a little bit more than that, comes from triglycerides. But remember, not all of your body can survive on the energy of fat. Some of your body, some body parts, like your brain, for example, and your nervous system, need glucose to survive, not fat. And that is why you cannot simply fast, go without eating, and expect your body to reduce your adipose lipid storage, to reduce fat. I mean, if you go without eating, right, your body will shed some pounds, including some fat, but it will also reduce muscle because it needs to break up muscle to get to the protein, to make glucose to feed your brain and to feed your central nervous system, right? A much, much more healthier way to reduce adipose lipid storage is simply to eat a balanced diet and to exercise regularly. Now remember, the energy involved here is fat, lipids. They have about 9 kilocalories per gram, whereas a carbohydrate or a protein has less than half of that, only 4 kilocalories per gram. And that means lipids are an extremely efficient source of energy and for energy storage. We store glucose as what? Glycogen, right? Where? In the liver. Because most cells cannot store glucose. And we store triglycerides in our adipose tissue because most cells cannot store lipids either. So we have different places in our body where we store energy for later use. It's part of a normal, healthy body. And there is more adaptive advantage to having fat stored in the adipose tissue. Because it turns out that fat is a horrible conductor of heat. It doesn't transfer that energy very well. And the result is that it actually insulates your body from colder temperatures or temperature extremes. It can also act as a natural shock absorption, for example, cushions for our organs and for our bones. If you do long distance or even short distance running, you probably wear good shoes, but you know the pain that can come with running, right? It's thanks to fat, not only for the energy that it takes to run, but for cushioning our feet. And as we've already talked about, it's a major component of cell membranes. So why does fat get such a bad rap if it does so many great things for our bodies? Well, it's not all fat that's getting the bad rap. It's primarily saturated fats, trans fats, and cholesterols. And these only begin to have a negative effect when our diet and our lifestyles are unbalanced. But what's going on with these nutrients? Why do we hear about them so often in the news? Now, we've talked about how cholesterol can accumulate in arteries, and that affects the flow of blood, which affects blood pressure, which can impact your heart and can lead to heart disease, which, by the way, happens to be the number one killer of adults in the US. It can also lead to heart attacks and strokes. It turns out that saturated fats and trans fats, which we mentioned are very similar, increase the cholesterol in your arteries that begins to accumulate. It's called LDL cholesterol. The more saturated fats, the more cholesterol, the more risk. And these things are connected. They play off of each other. So we can talk about heart disease, but that is only one risk factor, right? There's also cancer. Now, these types of lipids don't cause cancer, like they can cause heart disease anyway, but there is a relationship there. They certainly promote cancers once they have begun. And some studies even suggest that they can be a causal factor in some cancers, like breast cancer and colon cancer. And last, obesity. Remember, fat is energy dense. And if you eat more foods that are more enriched in fat, you get more energy. And that is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except that you might just exceed the amount of energy that your body actually needs, unless you are very physically active or doing very physically taxing work. And that means that your body will begin to store the excess energy. And that can lead to weight gain, which can lead to other health issues. In terms of being conscious of all of this and how it affects your body, keep in mind that we are talking about balance, about moderation, about nutrient-dense foods. Nutrient-dense foods, not energy-dense, right? Recall all of those recommendations that we briefly explored last week. So, you go to the store, you look around and you look at the desserts and you think, oh yeah, I remember. Fat is bad. And therefore, I'm going to buy this fat-free ice cream dessert. Well, first off, No, don't remember that. Fat is not bad. Fat is good. And many fat-free desserts have a ton of added sugars. In fact, so much added sugar that you might have a dessert that has the same amount, if not more kilocalories than a regular dessert. And that means cutting back on your fat and replacing it with carbs has done literally nothing for cutting back on energy and promoting weight loss. Remember, it's about making balanced decisions. So up on the screen, I have a sort of a stereotypical American lunch, which is a double bacon cheeseburger with French fries and a shake. Now, I'm guessing that many of us have probably eaten something like this. It might not be the exact same thing, but something in this ballpark. Well, that meal on the screen represents 1,600 kilocalories. That's nearly your entire daily recommendation for the average person, right? And of that 1,600, you get 90 grams of fat, of which 30 grams are saturated fats. This all is well in excess of dietary fat guidelines and recommendations. Yes, you got it. We know that there are negative effects of saturated trans fats and cholesterol, but we also need these types of lipids. This is in our foods naturally, our natural foods. Our bodies make some of it. So defining the limit where these nutrients begin to have harmful effects on our health is actually difficult, right? There is no RDA. There is no UL. The DRI suggests 20 to 35% of your daily energy from fats, less than 10% of your total daily energy coming from saturated fats, and as little trans fats as possible, which we've talked about, and as little as 300 milligrams of cholesterol. What does this mean if you are on the typical 2,000 kilocalorie a day diet or typical 2,000 kilocalorie a day intake? 20 to 35% of that total daily energy for a 2,000 kilocalorie intake is only 400 to 700 kilocalories, or in total 45 to 70 grams. So keep in mind that you need fat. Cutting fat out of your diet for weight or athletic purposes is not healthy, right? It's about balance. Our bodies need fat. Our bodies need saturated fats, trans fats, sterols like cholesterol, and of course, cis unsaturated fats. What about the monounsaturated fats and the polyunsaturated fats? Well, like we've talked about, you need all types of fat in your diet, and as the recommendations are to reduce saturated and trans and cholesterol fats in your diet, you should then increase other fats to meet that 20 to 35% intake. So replacing those fats with unsaturated fats. Replacing saturated with unsaturated reduces cholesterol levels in your blood, which lowers the risk of heart disease. And you can do this by making simple choices on a day-by-day basis. Your cooking, how you mix, how you fry, sauteing food. We tend to use butter, but using olive oil is a better choice. If you have a salad, you might put bacon on it, right? Well, instead of bacon, use sunflower seeds, right? Maybe you like cheese on your sandwich. Well, instead of cheese, try an avocado. It's got the same sort of texture, a different flavor, but a very similar texture. And it is healthier in terms of that balance of saturated and unsaturated fats. Maybe you love to eat meat, like a steak. Well, try salmon or some other fish instead. And one that some of you may find difficult is potato chips, right? Potatoes are or can be great. Well, try eating mixed nuts instead of potato chips sometimes. Again, it's not about giving up the foods that you love, and it's not about demonizing those foods. Because there's nothing wrong with those foods except for the value that we place on those foods within a cultural context, right? It's about moderation. Eating foods that are more enriched in the cis unsaturated fats and reduced in the trans and saturated fats and some of the other sterols, that's going to lead to a reduced risk of developing heart disease. In addition, especially unsaturated fats like the essential unsaturated fats, omega-3 and omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids protect our body against some cancers by suppressing inflammation. And there are other benefits like protection against bone loss and eye diseases and asthma and periodontal disease, which affects the gums, and the list goes on and on. Now, the recommendations for unsaturated fats doesn't really differ here. The general recommendation is to decrease the saturated trans and cholesterol and thereby increasing the other unsaturated fats. But the total fat recommendation or lipid recommendation is still the same, 20 to 35% of your total daily kilocalorie in terms of energy. And the DRI does provide some specifics in terms of the linoleic and linolenic acids. For the linoleic, 5 to 10% of your total daily energy, and for the linolenic, about 0.6 to twice that, 1.2% of your total daily energy intake. And to help you get there, the American Heart Association recommends that you eat fish at least twice a week, and especially fatty fish to get all of those unsaturated fats, so fish like salmon and mackerel. And last are the proteins. Proteins also suffer from common misconceptions. I think many people associate meat with protein and protein with strength, and therefore somebody might eat meat to build muscle mass, and that's not accurate. Protein is a vital structural and regulatory substance of cells, not just muscle cells, your body cells. And to build strength, your muscles, the muscle cells, need all the nutrients, not just protein. And they need physical activity, because eating protein doesn't actually build muscle, right? Meat is not the only source of protein, in addition. You can find protein in milk, eggs, legumes, many grains, even most vegetables. And because this is all stuff that you probably know. But the issue is that by overvaluing protein and by overemphasizing meat in a diet, someone may accidentally crowd out other equally important nutrients and foods. Protein is just one of the many nutrients needed for good health and needed to build muscle. So what are proteins? Well, proteins are really just chains of amino acids. That's all they are. Just various amino acids put together in different chains and then brought together in different structures. And all amino acids have the same basic structure. They all have a carbon with a hydrogen and an amino group and an acid group. And that is the same for every amino acid. But there is another group attached called a side group. And that side group differentiates the amino acids from one another. We have 20 different amino acids, and each one has a different side group. So amino acids and proteins are already really complex compared to carbohydrates and lipids. Now, it gets even more complex, and we won't get into all of that complexity. But first, our bodies can make 11 amino acids. That means 9 amino acids have to come from our diet. Now, these amino acids, these 20 different amino acids, can be put together in many, many different types of chains, which then can be brought together in many different types of structures. In fact, we have over 100,000 different proteins in our body, all coming from the same 20 amino acids. 11 that we can make, the non-essential amino acids, and 9 that you have to get from a balanced diet, the essential amino acids. Through the process of transcription and translation, we get an amino acid chain, all of these different individual amino acids that are bound together in a chain called a polypeptide chain. They're bound together the same way that a monosaccharide is bound to become a disaccharide, or that 3 fatty acids are bound with a glycerol to form a triglyceride. So you get these long amino acid or polypeptide chains that are typically over 100 amino acids long. Some are small, but most are well over 100. And some are several hundreds of amino acids long. Each protein is composed of a single or multiple chains of these 20 different amino acids. And you can put them together in so many different ways. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the structure of proteins. Let's just get into the function and the role of proteins. What do they do in our bodies? Whenever your body is growing or repairing or replacing or using tissues, proteins are involved. Proteins are used for structural materials, in other words. From the very moment of conception, proteins form the building blocks of your body, your muscles, your blood, your skin, your teeth, your bones. They form an integral part of your arterial lining, so your arteries can withstand the pressure of blood surging through them with each heartbeat. They sew together parts of torn tissues. They replace dead and damaged cells. Skin cells every 30 days are replaced. Hair and nail cells are constantly replaced because they're constantly growing. Muscle cells as they respond to exercise. Proteins also have many regulatory functions. Enzymes, for example. Some proteins act as enzymes, which is to say, catalysts. They allow reactions in the body to occur quickly and efficiently and with some direction, rather than just by random chance or whatever. For example, digestion. Digestion of all of the nutrients that you eat uses an enzyme, the digestive enzyme, which help break down that food material, and they help build materials like bone. They help transform materials like amino acids into glucose, right? Also, hormones. Some hormones are proteins, and all hormones are messengers. Insulin is a good example. It's a protein. It increases in your blood with an increase in blood glucose. Fluid balance. Proteins help to maintain your body's fluid balance. It maintains the proper amount of fluid, even the type of fluid in each area of your body. For example, the amount of liquid in a cell versus the amount of liquid outside of a cell. And somewhat related to the first three, they are also transporters. They move around with the body's fluids to carry nutrients or other molecules. Hemoglobin is an example. It carries oxygen from the lungs to the cells. And they're also involved in gene expression. Now, we didn't go into aspects of DNA, but they're involved in DNA replication and in the process of protein synthesis itself. And last, not least, is energy. Without energy, our cells would die and we would die, right? Without glucose, your brain and your nervous system would stop operating. All these proteins in our bodies, with all these unique actions that they do in the body, that only they can do, that only these individual proteins can do. And still, our body will sacrifice protein to provide energy and to provide glucose during times of starvation or fasting or reduced carbohydrate intake or insufficient carbohydrate intake. Your body will break down proteins to provide energy and glucose. And the principle is the same if you train incredibly hard, but you're not eating enough to account for that energy expenditure, that you're not actually getting enough energy, right? You will actually lose muscle mass and strength or endurance as a result of overtraining. And last, not least, is energy. Without energy, our cells would die and we would die, right? Without glucose, your brain and your nervous system would stop operating. All these proteins in our bodies, with all these unique actions that they do in the body, that only they can do, that only these individual proteins can do. And still, our body will sacrifice protein to provide energy and to provide glucose during times of starvation or fasting or reduced carbohydrate intake or insufficient carbohydrate intake. Your body will break down proteins to provide energy and glucose. And the principle is the same if you train incredibly hard, but you're not eating enough to account for that energy expenditure, that you're not actually getting enough energy, right? You will actually lose muscle mass and strength or endurance as a result of overtraining. I want to touch on a concept called protein quality. Protein quality can be extremely crucial to our bodies and to survival, especially in areas of the world where food is scarce and people are starving and can only access some protein-rich foods. This may not be important for you in the US and in many Western countries where food is abundant and where most people eat fairly large amounts of protein so they're able to get all the amino acids that they need. But protein quality can determine how you grow as a child and how an adult can maintain their health. Essentially, protein quality is determined by the amino acid content of each protein food item that you eat. Each protein is made of amino acids, right? And every protein is made of all 20 amino acids, just arranged differently in that chain. But the amount of each amino acid in the chain, the total amount of each amino acid in the chain, differs according to the protein. The amount of the 9 essential amino acids in every chain also differs. If you are not getting enough of a certain essential amino acid, not just some, but enough, then your body might need to break down proteins in other parts of your body, like your muscles or your blood or your eyes or wherever, to make other proteins. There are two basic types of proteins in terms of protein quality. We have high quality proteins and low quality protein. For high quality protein, this contains all of the amino acids that our bodies need, especially the essential amino acids. And it does all of this in approximately the same proportions as your body needs them, or in the same amounts that your body needs them. Now, we find that tends to be highest or the best in animal products. After all, we are an animal. We are made up of the same amino acids in about the same proportions and amounts as other animals. So things like meat, seafood, eggs, dairy products, milk, these have higher amounts of essential amino acids. And there are low-quality proteins that lack or tend to lack essential amino acids. Most vegetables, for example, lack 1 or 2 essential amino acids, which is generally why you need to supplement your diet with either animal protein, or you have to have an extremely well-balanced diet if you are a vegetarian. And that's one of the reasons why soy is often included in a vegetarian diet, because it is also a high-quality protein, having a lot of the essential amino acids and in approximately the same amounts that our bodies need them. In some cases, like corn, for example, corn lacks most of the essential amino acids. Again, diet is partly related to what we are, but also partly related to what we are adapted to. Up here on the screen, I've got meat and vegetables, and it says protein versus protein. 100 kilocalories of meat equals approximately 6 grams of protein. 100 kilocalories of broccoli equals 10 grams of protein. Now, that's fact is fact. You can't debate that. But you can go beneath the surface and ask, well, which one of these is high quality and low quality protein? Now, you can argue that some vegetables, like broccoli, has more protein per kilocalorie. That's accurate, but it tends to be a lower quality protein. You need to balance that out with additional fruits and vegetables. With all of this information that we have about proteins, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that a diet that either lacks proteins can lead to some devastating effects, or that is overly enriched in protein also has serious negative impacts on the body. Let's start with some of the deficiencies. We know that our bodies need protein to survive all of these functions that we talked about. If you are not getting enough protein, or even if you are only eating, like, for example, one protein source, and it happens to be a low quality protein source, and therefore you're not getting the proper essential amino acids, then your body will begin to break down other proteins so that those essential amino acids are available for protein synthesis. But eventually, you're going to run out of essential amino acids. And when it does, your body's activities are going to stop, right? It just can't do that anymore. Taking that to its endpoint, this can be lethal. But before it becomes lethal, this will have serious impacts on growth as a child, your body's ability to repair itself, to maintain health. It impairs your brain and your kidneys, and also reduces your body's ability to even absorb nutrients to begin with. It is fairly nasty, and we'll look at some cases of protein malnutrition towards the end of this term. An excess in protein can also lead to serious negative consequences. High protein diets and heart disease have been linked, especially diets high in red meats. In addition to that, cancer and protein-rich foods such as red meat or processed meats have also been linked. And I'm talking about meats that can be considered a carcinogen. So recently, red meat, beef, veal, pork, lamb, mutton, goat, has been classified along with processed meats, sausages and bacon, etc., as being linked to various cancers and therefore a carcinogen. So colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer. Diets in the United States, which tends to be high in protein intake anyway, also tends to be low in calcium intake. And our bones need both protein and calcium to remain strong. So again, going back to this notion of balance. But many people, adults, speaking about adults, experience osteoporosis as a result of a protein-enriched diet. And that means bone loss. Next is weight control. Protein is energy. We've gone over that. A diet high in energy can lead to weight gain. But the body doesn't store protein. Yet eating an excess, you'll increase body tissue. And protein is the main source of nitrogen, which is used to make and store carbohydrates and lipids. So it provides more storage ability. And you can turn it into glucose through glucogenesis. So you can store carbohydrates. And last, kidney disease. A diet high in proteins creates a lot of extra work for your kidneys, which can accelerate kidney deterioration. And that can lead to kidney disease. So what about the recommendations? And we've already gone over parts of this. 10 to 35% of the diet coming from protein in a 2,000 kilocalorie diet, that's about 200 to 700 kilocalories, or only 50 up to 175 grams, which is pretty high, 175. The RDA recommends 0.8 grams per kilogram of your body weight, which you can calculate if you are so interested. But the RDA also makes some clarifications on that. It does differ for different people. First, for children, it tends to be higher because you need to cover the costs for building new tissues in the body. The same reason that it's higher for pregnant and lactating women, but it is not higher for athletes compared to non-athletes. Most athletes tend to intake a higher amount of protein. Now, in some cases, an athlete's body will be using more protein, or maybe somebody has recommended an athlete to take more protein. But the RDA is the same for athletes and non-athletes. Most athletes typically do not actually need to increase their protein intake, because the additional food that they eat anyway to meet a higher energy requirement gives your body protein as well. And in some cases, the higher protein requirement still falls in that range of 10 to 35% of your total daily energy coming from protein. Now that percentage range is based off of actual grams, right? And we should be thinking about grams, the actual intake, rather than percentages. Now this may not make a lot of sense, so let me give you a quick example. Consider this. Again, this example is supposed to highlight the difference between proportions and an actual intake in terms of grams. So you're looking at an image in which you have two sizes of ground beef portions. Say that you want to eat 50 grams of protein. So 50 grams of protein is about 190 grams of lean ground beef. On the image, you're looking at a smaller 25 gram and a larger 325 gram portion of ground beef. The smaller 25 gram portion of ground beef has about 4 grams of protein. So that's not enough. The 325 grams of ground beef, which by the way is nearly double what you need, has about 90 grams of protein and about double the serving size of what you actually need, which is only about the size of a deck of cards. That's as much meat as you need in a day, something about the size of a deck of cards. That would be adequate, about 50 grams of protein. But most people, when you go to order a hamburger, if you eat meat and eat hamburgers, will order a larger hamburger and then think of it as only one serving, right? When in fact, in this example, if you order that large hamburger patty, you would be getting twice the serving size or more. Anyway, 50 grams of protein gives you about 200 kilocalories. Stay with me on this. If you are on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet, then 200 kilocalories is 10% of your diet. And your energy intake is adequate. And your protein intake is adequate. But if you were to cut back your kilocalorie intake for whatever reason to, say, 800 kilocalories a day, right? And you are still going to eat 50 grams of protein. That's still your goal for maintaining muscle, whatever it happens to be. That 50 grams of protein is still 200 kilocalories. Then that is suddenly not 10% of your diet. That suddenly jumps up to 25% of your total daily energy intake. Now, it's still the same amount of protein, right? But in this case, your energy intake is not adequate. And your protein intake, however, remains adequate. Still, because your energy intake is not adequate, you force your body to use that protein to meet other needs, to meet energy needs, rather than to replace and make all of the proteins that your body needs to maintain, to survive. So in that case, you need to increase your protein intake, right? But only in that case. If you are, say, an athlete and you're training hard, or you're just training hard and you're not an athlete, maybe your energy intake jumps up to 4,000 kilocalories a day, for example. And in that, say, you still eat only 50 grams of protein a day, which again is about 190 grams of lean beef, which is about equivalent to the size of a deck of cards. Then those 50 grams would only represent 5% of your total daily energy. Your total daily energy intake then is adequate, and your protein intake is also adequate at 50 grams. You do not need more protein because you give your body all the energy and the protein that it needs to survive. 50 grams up to 175 grams of protein is all your body needs to survive, to maintain, to repair, to build muscle. And guess what? On top of all of that, it is extremely easy to get protein in our diets, and adequate protein, even if you're exercising a lot. Think of this. Up on the screen, I've got an image of different types of grains. If you eat 6 ounces of grains, on the image that you're looking at, all of these different types of grains are about 1 ounce. So if you eat a few bagels and a bowl of cereal and a few slices of bread, then you've got your 6 ounces of grains, right? That would give you 6 ounces of grains, would give you 18 grams of protein. Let's say you also eat 2.5 cups of vegetables. I've got some vegetables up here on the screen. If you eat a handful of tomatoes, a couple of carrots, some peas, then you're there for 2.5 cups. 2.5 cups of vegetables gives you about 10 grams of protein. And say you drink 3 glasses of milk. 3 glasses of milk gives you about 24 grams of protein. And to finish it off, say you eat a mere 5.5 ounces of protein food, something like a lean chicken breast, which is about the size of a deck of cards. That will give you upwards of 50 grams of protein. Now, you've just taken into your body more than 100 grams of protein. That is more protein than the RDA recommends for most people. And for people in the United States, if you are getting an adequate energy and food intake, you are almost certainly getting more than an adequate protein intake. Again, assuming that you are accessing some high quality protein foods like dairy or soy or meat, etc. But still, we have a market and I guess a misconception or a misunderstanding in our culture that people are capitalizing on. And many people still feel compelled to take more protein into their body, to access protein through supplements, for example. And that is the last thing I want to talk about in this lecture on macronutrients, protein supplements, and this idea that you need those in order to achieve adequate protein intake. Now, everywhere you turn, websites and health food stores and popular magazines and commercials, protein supplements are everywhere, and consumers in the US alone spend billions of dollars on these supplements. I mean, if you combine all supplements together, in 2015, in the US alone, we spent $21 billion, consumers, on those supplements. Protein in our society is billed as some sort of a magic potion. I mean, it is billed that way or portrayed that way. This idea that we need to take protein supplements to build muscle, especially if you are a bodybuilder or an athlete, that you need to take protein supplements to spare your own body's protein while you're on a diet for dieters, or that women should take protein supplements to strengthen fingernails, or people can take amino acid supplements to cure various things like herpes or insomnia, or to help lose weight, or to relieve pain, or to cure depression. Whatever it happens to be, these are all magical solutions to health problems or concerns, and protein or amino acid supplements do not work those miracles. Because your body builds muscle, protein, from amino acid. Many people take protein powders with the misconception or the false hope that protein powder will stimulate muscle growth. But guess what? Muscle doesn't work that way. Muscle isn't built that way. Muscle work builds muscle. Protein supplements do not. And most athletes involved in sports that are not bodybuilding do not need additional protein. You get more than enough protein in a regular diet to support protein synthesis and muscle gains, and taking more than enough protein does not enhance muscle growth or function. Again, protein powders do give you amino acids, but protein in natural foods gives you all the amino acids that you need for muscle building. Plus, they give you more, right, than just the amino acids. And whey protein is incredibly popular in our culture, and that claims to enhance athletic performance or to increase protein synthesis. However, there is zero support for the first one. There is zero support that this does anything to enhance performance. Second, whey protein is a waste product of our cheese manufacturing corporations. They claim that there is this increase in protein synthesis by taking whey protein supplements. Even if there is an increase in protein synthesis, that does not translate to building muscle. Still, there is some research that does support that there is a very small increase in protein synthesis that occurs by taking whey protein supplements. That increase is not statistically significant, and it is not lasting, meaning it is not a lasting effect on your body. Take that and compare it to other research that shows there is actually a significantly larger increase in protein synthesis by simply drinking a glass of milk a day. which also contains whey protein. We can say the same thing for weight loss or insomnia or depression or growing stronger fingernails or curing cold sores. There is no support for any of these claims in terms of peer-reviewed scientific research. But we do have evidence that by taking amino acid supplements, you flood your body with certain amino acids. And that means your body takes up more of that particular amino acid. And in doing so, it will take up less of the other 19 amino acids. And that can lead to nutrient, which is to say specific amino acid deficiencies, or amino acid toxicities, which can have effects like headaches, diarrhea, nausea, anxiety, insomnia, etc., etc., etc. So in some cases, you can say they cause the actual symptoms that they claim to cure. All right, let's go ahead and stop there for this lecture on macronutrients, part 2. I know that's a lot of material. Stay focused on some of the big picture issues. What are the roles, the functions, and where does culture begin to seep into this in terms of misconceptions, misunderstandings, uses, etc. Whenever you are ready, you can start the last lecture this week on energy balance.